A millionaire's perfect life shatters when he sees his ex-fiancée with 3 boys who share his eyes. What he discovers next will change everything he believed about love, family, and redemption. The rain drummed against the windshield of the black sedan as Alexander Sterling adjusted his silk tie, checking his reflection in the rearview mirror one final time. His steel gray eyes, the same ones that had closed countless business deals worth millions, now carried the weight of another successful acquisition. The Meridian Corporation had just become his latest conquest, adding another floor to his empire that stretched across the city's skyline. Alexander had built his fortune from nothing, clawing his way from a childhood spent in foster homes to becoming one of the most feared and respected entrepreneurs in the financial district. At 35, he commanded boardrooms with the same precision a conductor leads an orchestra, every gesture calculated, every word measured for maximum impact. His penthouse apartment overlooked the city like a throne room, filled with awards, certificates, and photographs of himself shaking hands with politicians and celebrities. But success had come at a price that Alexander had convinced himself was worth paying. The traffic light turned red, and his luxury vehicle came to a smooth stop. Alexander reached for his phone to review the evening's agenda when something in his peripheral vision made his breath catch in his throat. There, standing at the bus stop across the street, was a figure that made time itself seem to freeze. Isabella, the woman who had walked out of his life years ago, taking with her the only genuine love he had ever known. She stood there, slightly older but still breathtakingly beautiful, her auburn hair catching the dim streetlight. Alexander's hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, his heart pounding against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. But Isabella wasn't alone. 3 young boys stood beside her, huddled close against the evening chill. Alexander's vision blurred for a moment as he focused on their faces. The oldest couldn't have been more than 8, with the same determined jawline that Alexander saw in the mirror every morning. The middle child, perhaps 6, had those unmistakable steel-gray eyes that had become Alexander's trademark in business negotiations. The youngest, barely 4, possessed the same dark hair that Alexander had inherited from his unknown father. The phone in Alexander's hand slipped, clattering to the floor of the car. His breathing became shallow, each inhale feeling like he was drowning in disbelief. These children weren't just similar to him. They were mirror images, small replicas that seemed to have stepped out of his own childhood photographs. Isabella pulled out her phone, presumably calling for a ride-sharing service. The boys pressed closer to her, and Alexander could see her lips moving as she spoke to them, probably reassuring them that their ride would arrive soon. The maternal tenderness in her gestures struck Alexander like lightning, illuminating memories he had buried beneath layers of corporate success and emotional detachment. He remembered the last fight they had, the cruel words he had thrown at her like daggers. Isabella had begged him to slow down, to consider starting a family, to choose love over the relentless pursuit of wealth and power. Alexander had responded with the cold calculation that had served him well in business, but destroyed everything meaningful in his personal life. "I don't have time for fairy tales, Isabella," he had said, his voice cutting through her tears like ice. "Marriage and children are distractions I can't afford. If you can't understand that success requires sacrifice, then maybe you're not the person I thought you were." She had looked at him with eyes full of pain and disappointment before quietly gathering her belongings and walking out of his penthouse apartment. Alexander had convinced himself he felt relief, that her departure had removed an obstacle to his ambitions. He threw himself deeper into his work, acquiring companies and accumulating wealth with ruthless efficiency. But now, staring at those 3 boys who carried his features like living proof of a life he had rejected, Alexander felt something crack inside his chest. The armor of indifference he had carefully constructed over the years began to crumble, piece by piece. The traffic light turned green, but Alexander couldn't move. Cars began honking behind him, their drivers growing impatient, but he remained frozen, watching as Isabella and the 3 boys climbed into a modest vehicle that pulled up to the curb. Through the rain-streaked window, Alexander caught one final glimpse of the oldest boy's face, and for a moment, their eyes met across the distance. It was like looking at himself as a child, back when he still believed in things like family and belonging. The boy's gaze held a curious intelligence, the same spark that had driven Alexander to build his empire. But there was something else there too. Something Alexander had lost years ago in his climb to the top. Innocence, hope, the capacity for unconditional love. As the vehicle disappeared into the evening traffic, Alexander finally pressed the accelerator, his mind reeling with questions that threatened to unravel everything he thought he knew about his life. Were those children his sons? Had Isabella been pregnant when she left him? Why hadn't she told him? The drive to his penthouse felt like traveling through a fog of disbelief and mounting dread. Alexander's usual confidence, the unwavering certainty that had made him millions, crumbled beneath the weight of possibility. He thought about the timing, counting back the years since Isabella's departure, and the mathematics of the situation made his stomach turn. Standing in his elevator, ascending to the 50th floor of his residential tower, Alexander caught his reflection in the polished steel doors. The man staring back at him looked successful, powerful, untouchable. But behind those steel-gray eyes, the same eyes he had seen in that little boy's face, lurked a growing terror that his greatest triumph might also be his most devastating failure. The elevator doors opened to reveal his pristine apartment, filled with expensive furniture and empty spaces where a family might have lived, laughed, and loved. Alexander walked to his floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out over the city he had conquered, wondering if he had won everything that didn't matter while losing everything that did. Somewhere out there, 3 boys who might be his sons were going to bed without knowing their father's name. And somewhere out there, the only woman he had ever truly loved was tucking them in, probably never speaking of the man who had chosen money over the chance to be part of something real and beautiful. The rain continued to fall against the windows, each drop sounding like an accusation, a reminder of the life he might have thrown away in his relentless pursuit of success. Alexander Sterling, master of the corporate world, had never felt more powerless in his life. Alexander stood motionless in his penthouse office, the untouched cup of coffee growing cold on his mahogany desk. The city sprawled beneath him like a chessboard, where he had moved pieces for years. But today every victory felt hollow. The image of those 3 boys burned in his mind like a brand, their faces haunting him through a sleepless night that stretched into dawn. His personal assistant, Margaret, knocked softly before entering with her usual morning briefings. She had worked for Alexander for over a decade, witnessing his transformation from ambitious entrepreneur to corporate titan. Her silver hair was always perfectly styled, her demeanor professional yet maternal in a way that Alexander had never quite acknowledged. "Sir, the Henderson acquisition requires your signature, and the board meeting has been moved to this afternoon," Margaret said, placing documents on his desk. She paused, studying his face with the keen observation that came from years of reading his moods. "Are you feeling well? You look like you haven't slept." Alexander turned from the window, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. "Margaret, I need you to do something for me, something confidential." Her eyebrows raised slightly, but her expression remained neutral. "Of course, sir. I need you to hire the best private investigator in the city. Someone discreet, someone who can find information without leaving footprints." Alexander's voice carried a weight that Margaret had never heard before. "I need to locate someone from my past." Margaret nodded, making notes in her tablet. "May I ask what this pertains to?" Alexander hesitated, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "Family matters." The word family hung in the air like something fragile and dangerous. Alexander had built his identity around being self-made, independent, needing no one. The concept of family had been relegated to Christmas cards from distant relatives and obligatory charity events, where he wrote checks for children's organizations without ever truly considering the children themselves. Within hours, Margaret had arranged a meeting with Vincent Chen, a former federal investigator whose reputation for discretion and thoroughness had made him the go-to choice for high-profile clients seeking sensitive information. Vincent arrived at Alexander's office that afternoon, a man in his 40s with intelligent dark eyes and the quiet confidence of someone who had seen every kind of human secret. "Mr. Sterling, I understand you need someone located," Vincent said, settling into the leather chair across from Alexander's desk. "What can you tell me about this person?" Alexander found himself struggling to form the words. "Isabella Martinez. She would be in her early 30s now. We were engaged years ago, but she left without explanation." The lie came easily, a habit of omitting uncomfortable truths that had served him well in business. I recently saw her in the city, and I'd like to reconnect. Vincent made notes without judgment, his expression neutral. Do you have any other information? Last known address, employment, family connections? She was studying to be a teacher when we were together. She volunteered at community centers, always helping children from difficult backgrounds. As Alexander spoke, memories surfaced like photographs long buried in a forgotten album. Isabella reading to kids at the local shelter. Isabella organizing fundraisers for school supplies. Isabella's face lighting up whenever she talked about making a difference in young lives. I'll need a few days to track down current information, Vincent said, closing his notebook. My fee is substantial, but I assume that's not a concern for you. Alexander nodded absently. Money had always been his solution to every problem, his universal key to unlock any door. But as Vincent left his office, Alexander realized that some doors couldn't be bought open. Some truths required courage he wasn't sure he possessed. Days passed in a blur of routine meetings and strategic decisions, but Alexander's mind remained fractured, part of him functioning in boardrooms while another part wandered through possibilities that grew more terrifying with each passing hour. He found himself staring at families in restaurants, watching fathers with their children, studying the easy intimacy that seemed as foreign to him as speaking an ancient language. His phone buzzed during a merger discussion, Vincent's name appearing on the screen. Alexander excused himself from the conference room, his heart hammering against his ribs. I found her. Vincent's voice was calm and professional. Isabella Martinez, currently working as a principal at Riverside Elementary School. She lives in Maple Grove, a suburb about 30 minutes from downtown. She has 3 sons, Daniel, Marcus, and little James. The names hit Alexander like physical blows. Daniel, Marcus, James. His potential sons had names, identities, lives that had unfolded without him. Are you certain about the children's ages? Daniel appears to be around 8, Marcus approximately 6, and James looks to be about 4. Mr. Sterling, are you still there? Alexander's office seemed to tilt around him. The timeline aligned perfectly with Isabella's departure, with the months of silence that had followed their devastating argument. Yes, I'm here. What else did you find? She's well respected in her community. Never married, raising the boys on her own. They live modestly but comfortably. The children attend the school where she works. From what I can observe, they're a close-knit family. Close-knit. The words stung Alexander more than any business failure ever had. Somewhere across the city, his potential sons were growing up in the kind of warm, loving environment he had never known, guided by a mother he had driven away with his arrogance and misplaced priorities. There's something else, Vincent continued. I did some background research on you, as I do with all clients. Based on the timing and the children's physical characteristics, I believe there's a strong possibility these boys are yours. The resemblance is quite striking, particularly the oldest boy. Alexander closed his eyes, the confirmation hitting him like an avalanche he had been trying to outrun. Thank you, Vincent. Send me their address and your final bill. Mr. Sterling, if I may offer some advice from someone who has seen many family reunification cases, tread carefully. Children's lives are delicate, and rushing into complicated situations can cause more harm than good. The call ended, leaving Alexander alone with a truth that redefined everything he thought he understood about his life. He had 3 sons, 3 children who carried his genetics, his potential, his capacity for both greatness and destruction. They were growing up without knowing their father existed, while he had spent years accumulating wealth that suddenly seemed meaningless compared to the richness they might have added to his existence. Alexander walked to his window wall, pressing his palm against the cool glass. The city spread out below him like a kingdom he had conquered, but all he could think about were 3 small boys eating dinner at a modest table, probably helping their mother with homework, sharing stories about their day at school where she worked to support them alone. He thought about Isabella, the woman who had loved him enough to envision a future together, who had tried to show him that success without connection was just elaborate loneliness. She had built the family he had rejected, creating warmth and belonging in a way his corporate achievements never could. The weight of realization settled over Alexander like a shroud. He had everything he thought he wanted, and nothing he actually needed. His penthouse was magnificent and empty. His bank accounts were full while his life remained hollow. He had chosen power over love, control over vulnerability, and the cost had been higher than he could have imagined. Margaret knocked again, entering with evening documents requiring his attention. She took one look at his face and set the papers aside. "Sir, are you all right?" Alexander turned from the window, and for the first time in years, his carefully constructed mask slipped completely. "Margaret, what do you know about being a father?" Her expression softened with understanding and concern. "Are you thinking about starting a family, Mr. Sterling?" Alexander's laugh was hollow and painful. "I'm thinking about the family I might have already lost." The address burned in Alexander's mind like a physical wound as his driver navigated through the tree-lined streets of Maple Grove. Each turn brought him closer to a reality he had spent years running from, and with every passing block, his chest tightened until breathing felt like drowning in reverse. The suburban neighborhood couldn't have been more different from his glass towers and marble lobbies. Here, children's bicycles lay scattered on front lawns, and the sound of laughter drifted through open windows like music from another world. Alexander's hands trembled as he instructed his driver to stop 3 houses away from the modest 2-story home where his sons lived. The word sons still felt foreign in his mouth, like speaking a language he had never learned, but somehow understood in his bones. Through the tinted windows of his sedan, he watched a scene that would haunt him forever. There was Isabella, kneeling in the front yard, her hair catching the late afternoon sunlight as she helped little James tie his shoes. The 4-year-old giggled as he struggled with the laces, his small hands working with determined concentration. Alexander's breath caught when he saw the child's profile. It was like looking at a photograph of himself from 3 decades ago, the same stubborn jawline, the same way of furrowing his brow when focused. Marcus, the middle child, was riding a second-hand bicycle in circles around the driveway, his steel-gray eyes bright with joy as he called out to his mother. "Mom, watch this!" he shouted, attempting a small jump over a garden hose. Isabella clapped enthusiastically, her face radiant with the kind of pure happiness Alexander had forgotten existed. The sight of those familiar eyes in his son's face hit him like lightning, a recognition so profound it made his vision blur. But it was Daniel, the oldest, who delivered the final blow to Alexander's composure. The 8-year-old sat on the front steps reading a book, occasionally looking up to supervise his younger brothers with a maturity that reminded Alexander painfully of his own childhood. The boy had been forced to grow up too quickly, just as Alexander had in foster care. But instead of hardness, Daniel's face showed only gentle responsibility and love for his family. Alexander's chest constricted as he watched Isabella gather all 3 boys for what appeared to be their daily ritual, homework time on the front porch. She produced a small folding table and helped each child organize their schoolwork, her patience infinite, as she explained math problems to Marcus and read with James. The scene was so achingly normal, so beautifully ordinary, that Alexander felt something crack open inside him that had been sealed shut for years. This was what he had thrown away. This warmth, this connection, this meaning that no corporate acquisition could ever replicate. He had chosen board meetings over bedtime stories, profit margins over birthday parties, power lunches over family dinners. The weight of his choices crushed down on him like a physical force, making his breathing shallow and desperate. His phone rang, jolting him from his trance. Margaret's voice sounded concerned even through the speaker. "Mr. Sterling, the Morrison deal requires your immediate attention. The contracts are waiting for your signature." Alexander stared at the phone as if it were an artifact from an alien civilization. The Morrison deal, a $50 million acquisition that had consumed his attention for months, suddenly seemed as insignificant as counting grains of sand. "Handle it, Margaret. I'm not available." "Sir, this is highly unusual. You've never missed a deal closing." Through the window, Alexander watched Isabella help James sound out words in his picture book, the little boy's face scrunched in concentration. When he finally got the word right, all 3 brothers cheered, and Isabella kissed the top of his head with such tenderness that Alexander felt tears burn behind his eyes for the first time in decades. "Margaret, what do you know about forgiveness?" Alexander's voice cracked like ice breaking under pressure. There was a long pause before his assistant responded, her tone gentle with understanding. "I know it's something we give others, Mr. Sterling, but more importantly, it's something we must learn to give ourselves." The call ended, leaving Alexander alone with the devastating tableau playing out before him. He watched as the family moved inside for dinner, the windows glowing warm and golden as Isabella moved around the kitchen. The boys set the table together, their chatter and laughter filtering through the evening air like an anthem of everything he had missed. Alexander closed his eyes and let himself imagine a different version of his life, coming home to this house instead of an empty penthouse, helping with homework instead of reviewing quarterly reports, tucking his sons into bed instead of working until midnight on deals that would be forgotten in a year, reading bedtime stories instead of financial projections, being needed for comfort instead of just profit. The physical pain in his chest intensified until he could barely sit upright. This wasn't just regret. This was grief for a life he had murdered with his own ambition. He had killed the possibility of this family as surely as if he had taken a weapon to it, choosing money over meaning, success over love, power over purpose. A movement in the upstairs window caught his attention. Daniel had appeared at what must be his bedroom window, looking out at the street with those intelligent eyes that mirrored Alexander's own. For a heart-stopping moment, the boy seemed to be staring directly at the sedan, where Alexander sat hidden. The child's expression was curious but not alarmed, as if he sensed something significant, but couldn't name it. Alexander's heart hammered against his ribs as he stared back at his oldest son, this child who had grown from baby to boy without ever knowing his father's name. Daniel had Alexander's eyes, his bone structure, his way of tilting his head when thinking. But the boy also had something Alexander had lost long ago: openness, trust, the capacity for uncomplicated joy. The window went dark as Daniel moved away, probably called to dinner by his mother. Alexander sat in the gathering twilight, watching the warm glow from the kitchen windows where his family shared their evening meal. He could almost hear their conversation. Imagine Isabella asking about their day, the boys competing to tell the funniest story from school, little James probably getting more food on his face than in his mouth. This was intimacy. This was belonging. This was everything his penthouse apartment with its city views and expensive furniture would never be. He had built a monument to his success, but Isabella had built a home. He had accumulated assets, but she had created a family. He had won every competition that didn't matter while losing the only one that did. Alexander's driver cleared his throat softly. "Sir, shall we return to your building?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Alexander could return to his world of mergers and acquisitions, pretend he had never seen this glimpse of what might have been. He could bury himself in work and convince himself that this family was better off without him. He could maintain the comfortable lie that his success justified every sacrifice he had made. But as he stared at the house where his sons were growing up without him, where the woman he had loved was creating the life he had rejected, Alexander felt something shift inside him, like tectonic plates realigning. The man who had built an empire on calculated risks was about to face the most terrifying gamble of his life. "No," he said quietly, his voice stronger than he felt. "We wait." For what? He wasn't sure. Permission. Courage. A sign that he deserved a second chance at the most important job he had ever walked away from. Alexander Sterling, master of hostile takeovers and complex negotiations, had no strategy for winning back a family he had never allowed himself to have. But as the stars appeared over Maple Grove, and the lights in his sons' bedrooms went out one by one, Alexander made a decision that would either redeem him or destroy what little peace Isabella had built in his absence. He was going to fight for them, not with lawyers or money or corporate power, but with the only weapon that might matter: the truth about what he had become, and what he was willing to sacrifice to become the father his boys deserved. The next morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made everything seem possible and terrifying at once. Alexander had spent the night pacing his penthouse, rehearsing conversations that felt inadequate and planning approaches that crumbled under scrutiny. By dawn, he had made a decision that went against every calculated instinct that had built his fortune. He would go to Riverside Elementary School and see Isabella in her professional environment, hoping that neutral ground might soften the inevitable collision of their past and present. Alexander arrived at the school during what appeared to be morning drop-off time, his luxury sedan conspicuous among the modest family vehicles and yellow school buses. Through his tinted windows, he watched a symphony of ordinary miracles, parents kissing children goodbye, teachers greeting students with genuine warmth, kids running toward friends with backpacks bouncing behind them like colorful wings. Then he saw them. Isabella emerged from a practical sedan that had seen better years but was meticulously maintained, her professional attire elegant despite its obvious economy. She moved with the confident grace of someone who had found her calling, her face animated as she spoke to Daniel, Marcus, and James. The boys flanked her like devoted guardians, each carrying their school bags with the pride of children who knew their mother worked in the same building where they learned. Alexander's chest seized as he watched Daniel help James with his heavy backpack, the 8-year-old's natural leadership already evident. Marcus bounced beside them, chattering excitedly about something that made Isabella laugh, a sound that hit Alexander like a physical blow, reminding him of mornings they might have shared if he had chosen differently. As the family approached the school entrance, disaster struck in the way that changes everything in a single moment. James, distracted by a butterfly, suddenly broke away from the group and ran directly into the path of an oncoming delivery truck, making its way through the parking lot. Time fractured into crystalline fragments. Isabella's scream pierced the morning air like breaking glass. Daniel lunged forward with reflexes beyond his years, but he was too far away. The truck driver, caught off guard, slammed on brakes that would never stop in time. Alexander moved without conscious thought, his body responding to a paternal instinct he hadn't known existed. He threw open his car door and sprinted across the parking lot with a speed that defied his business suit and leather shoes. The world compressed into a tunnel of singular focus. His son, his 4-year-old boy with his stubborn cowlick and gap-toothed smile, about to be crushed by forces beyond his understanding. Alexander reached James a split second before impact, scooping the child up and rolling both of them away from the truck's path. They tumbled across the asphalt in a tangle of limbs and torn fabric, Alexander's body instinctively shielding the boy from the rough surface. The truck shuddered to a stop mere inches from where they had landed, its engine ticking in the sudden silence that follows near catastrophe. For a moment, the world held its breath. Then James looked up at Alexander with those familiar steel-gray eyes, eyes that mirrored his own, and whispered, "Thank you, mister. You saved me." Alexander's heart exploded into fragments of joy and agony so intense he could barely speak. This was his son, his flesh and blood, looking at him with trust and gratitude while having no idea they shared the same DNA. The child's small hand rested against Alexander's chest, right over the heart that had just discovered its true purpose. "Are you hurt?" Alexander managed to ask, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't name. James shook his head, then smiled with the resilience that only children possess. "I'm okay, but your suit is all dirty now. I'm sorry." The apology nearly destroyed Alexander's composure entirely. His son was apologizing to him, worried about damage to expensive clothing when Alexander would have gladly burned every suit he owned for this moment of connection. "James!" Isabella's voice cut through Alexander's trance as she ran toward them, her face white with terror and relief. Daniel and Marcus flanked her, both boys crying openly as they saw their little brother safe in a stranger's arms. Isabella dropped to her knees beside them, her hands shaking as she examined James for injuries. "Oh my God, baby, are you okay? You scared Mommy so much." Her voice broke on the last words, and she pulled James into an embrace that spoke of a mother's worst nightmare barely avoided. Then Isabella looked up at Alexander, and their eyes met for the first time in years. The recognition hit her like a physical blow. He could see it in the way her face went from grateful to shocked, to something approaching devastation. Her lips formed his name silently, as if speaking it aloud might shatter the fragile moment. "Alexander," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of arriving teachers and concerned parents. "Hello, Isabella." The words felt inadequate, ridiculous even, given the circumstances. Here he was, holding his son after preventing a tragedy, greeting the woman he had loved and lost as if they were casual acquaintances meeting at a coffee shop. Marcus stepped closer, studying Alexander's face with the intense curiosity of a 6-year-old. "Mom, do you know the hero man? He has eyes like mine." The innocent observation landed like a bomb in the circle of their family. Daniel, mature beyond his years, looked between Alexander and his mother with dawning understanding. Isabella's face went pale as she realized that her carefully constructed world was about to be examined by three pairs of eyes that shared their father's intelligence. "We should talk," Alexander said quietly, still holding James, who seemed reluctant to leave the safety of his rescuer's arms. Isabella nodded, her professional composure battling with personal chaos. "Boys, go with Mrs. Patterson to class. Mommy needs to speak with this gentleman about what happened." "But Mom," Daniel protested, his protective instincts toward his mother evident. "Shouldn't we stay? He saved James." "And I want to thank him properly," Isabella said, her voice steady despite the earthquake happening behind her eyes. "Go to class. We'll talk about this later." As the boys reluctantly followed their teacher into the building, James turned back to wave at Alexander. "Bye, hero man. Thank you for saving me." The words hit Alexander like arrows made of pure emotion. His son was walking away from him again, but this time it felt different. This time, James carried a memory of his father as someone who had protected him, someone who had put his life at risk without hesitation. Left alone in the parking lot with Isabella, Alexander felt the weight of years and choices pressing down like atmospheric pressure before a storm. The woman he had loved stood before him, no longer the young dreamer he remembered, but someone who had grown into strength and purpose without him. "We need to talk," Isabella said, her voice carrying the authority she had developed as an educator and single mother. "But not here. Not now." Alexander nodded, understanding that this conversation would require privacy and time neither of them had in a school parking lot. "When?" "Tonight, after the boys are asleep. Maple Grove Park, by the lake, 9 o'clock. She turned to walk away, then stopped, her shoulders tense with the weight of everything unsaid. "Alexander, those boys don't know about you. They've never asked about their father because I told them he wasn't ready to be one. Don't make me a liar about that." The challenge in her voice was clear, and it cut deeper than any business rival's attack ever had. Isabella was giving him one chance to prove he had become someone worthy of the title father, or to confirm her decision to protect their sons from the man who had chosen ambition over love. As Alexander watched her walk into the school, where she had built a life without him, he realized that saving James from the truck had been the easy part. The real rescue of his family, his relationship with Isabella, and his own soul was about to begin. And unlike every other negotiation in his life, this was one where money, power, and corporate strategy would mean nothing. This would be won or lost on the content of his character, and Alexander wasn't sure he had enough of that currency to make the purchase that mattered most. The hours between Isabella's ultimatum and their appointed meeting crawled by like a slow torture designed specifically for Alexander's tormented mind. He cancelled every appointment, ignored every call, and dismissed Margaret's increasingly concerned inquiries with the detached efficiency of a man preparing for his own execution. By evening, he had worn a path in his penthouse carpet, rehearsing speeches that crumbled under the weight of his own inadequacy. Maple Grove Park after dark was a different world from the cheerful suburban landscape he had observed during daylight hours. Ancient oak trees cast shadows like judgment across the walking paths, and the lake stretched out like a mirror reflecting stars he had forgotten existed above the city's glow. Alexander arrived early, needing time to gather courage he wasn't sure he possessed. The park bench beside the water became his confessional booth, though he had no priest to grant absolution for the sins he was about to catalogue. The gentle lapping of water against the shore provided a rhythm for his racing thoughts as he watched couples stroll hand in hand and families with young children heading home after evening adventures. At precisely 9 o'clock, Isabella appeared like a figure stepping out of his most haunting dreams. She had changed from her professional attire into jeans and a simple sweater, looking more like the woman he remembered falling in love with years ago. But her posture carried an authority he didn't recognize, the backbone of someone who had learned to stand alone against whatever life threw at her. She sat on the opposite end of the bench, creating a careful distance that felt like an ocean between them. For several minutes, neither spoke, both staring out at the moonlight dancing on the lake's surface. The silence stretched and contracted like a living thing, filled with years of unspoken words and unanswered questions. "They're your sons," Isabella finally said, her voice cutting through the night air with surgical precision. All three of them, Daniel, Marcus, and James. Your DNA, your eyes, your stubborn streak that shows up whenever they don't want to eat vegetables. Alexander felt the confirmation hit his chest like a physical blow, even though he had known it with certainty since that first glimpse at the bus stop. Hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that changed the fundamental structure of his identity. He wasn't just Alexander Sterling, corporate titan. He was a father who had missed everything that mattered. "When did you know you were pregnant?" His voice came out as a whisper, afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter this moment of truth. "The morning after you told me that children were distractions you couldn't afford." Isabella's words carried no malice, just the exhaustion of someone who had carried this secret for years. "I was going to tell you that night. I had planned this whole romantic dinner, bought a little gift box with a positive pregnancy test inside. I was so excited to share the news with the man I loved." Alexander closed his eyes, the image of what that conversation might have been like, playing out in his mind like a movie of a life he had murdered before it could begin. Isabella, radiant with joy, presenting him with the greatest gift anyone could offer. His response would have destroyed that joy completely. "Instead, you told me I wasn't worth your time if I couldn't understand that success required sacrifice," she continued, her voice steady despite the pain he could hear underneath. "You made it clear that a family would be nothing but an obstacle to your ambitions. So I made the decision to remove that obstacle from your life. Isabella, I'm not finished." Her tone carried the authority of a principal who had learned to command attention from unruly children and adults alike. "I spent the next few months trying to figure out how to tell you. I wrote letters I never sent. I picked up the phone 100 times and hung up before dialing. I even showed up at your office building once, but couldn't bring myself to go inside." Alexander remembered those months after their breakup, how he had thrown himself into work with renewed intensity, convinced that Isabella's departure had freed him to achieve even greater success. While she had been struggling with the biggest decision of her life, he had been calculating profit margins and negotiating contracts that seemed important at the time, but couldn't even remember now. "Why didn't you try harder to reach me?" The question escaped before he could stop it, and he immediately regretted the accusation it implied. Isabella turned to look at him directly for the first time since sitting down, her eyes blazing with a fury that had been banked but never extinguished. "Because you made your priorities crystal clear, Alexander. You chose money over love. You chose power over partnership. You chose your corporate empire over the possibility of building something real and lasting with me." Her words hit him like bullets made of truth, each one finding its mark in the places where his conscience should have been protecting him. "But more importantly," she continued, "I realized that my children deserved better than a father who saw them as inconveniences to be managed around board meetings and acquisition deals." The phrase "my children" cut deeper than any boardroom betrayal Alexander had ever experienced. These boys, his flesh and blood, had grown up thinking of themselves as belonging entirely to their mother because their father had forfeited any claim to them before they were even born. "Tell me about them," Alexander said, his voice breaking on the words. "Tell me who they are." Isabella's expression softened slightly, the way any mother's face changes when asked about her children. "Daniel is brilliant, just like you were at that age. He reads everything he can get his hands on and asks questions that make me scramble for answers. But unlike you, he uses his intelligence to help others. He tutors younger kids at school and helps his brothers with their homework every night." Alexander felt a surge of pride mixed with devastating regret. His son had inherited his intellectual gifts, but had developed the compassion Alexander had systematically eliminated from his own character. "Marcus is our little entrepreneur," Isabella continued, and Alexander could hear the love in her voice. "He started a neighborhood dog walking service when he was 5 and saved every penny to buy James a bicycle for his birthday. He has your determination, but he uses it to take care of his family instead of accumulating wealth for its own sake." The comparison stung because it was accurate and deserved. Marcus had learned at 5 what Alexander had failed to understand at 35, that success meant nothing if it wasn't shared with people you loved. "And James," Isabella's voice grew tender, "James is pure joy. He sees magic in everything. Butterflies, puddles after rain, the way sunlight looks through windows. He's the one who keeps us all laughing when things get difficult. He has your curiosity about the world, but he hasn't learned to be cynical about what he discovers. Alexander felt tears burning behind his eyes as he imagined these three remarkable children growing up in a home filled with love and laughter, while he had been building monuments to his own ego. They sound incredible. They are, and they've done just fine without you. Isabella's words weren't cruel, just matter of fact, which somehow made them hurt more. Daniel has never asked why he doesn't have a father like other kids. Marcus assumes that some families are just different. James has never known any life except the one we've built together. The implication was clear. These children had thrived in Alexander's absence, which meant his presence hadn't been necessary for their happiness or success. He was the missing piece of a puzzle that had already formed a complete picture without him. "What do you want from me, Isabella?" Alexander asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Money? Support? Or do you want me to stay away from them permanently?" Isabella was quiet for so long that Alexander wondered if she had decided not to answer at all. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that made the night air feel heavy around them. "I want to know if you've changed, Alexander. I want to know if the man who saved James today is the same one who told me that love was a luxury he couldn't afford. Because if you haven't changed, if you're still the person who measures worth in dollars and power instead of connection and commitment, then I need you to walk away right now and never come back." She stood up, wrapping her arms around herself against the evening chill. "But if you have changed, if you've learned that being needed is more important than being feared, then maybe we can figure out how to introduce you to your sons without destroying the security they've always known." Alexander felt the weight of the most important decision of his life settling on his shoulders. Isabella was offering him a chance at redemption, but only if he could prove he deserved it. The corporate raider who had built an empire on hostile takeovers was being asked to surrender completely to win the only prize that had ever really mattered. "I have changed," he said, standing to face her. "Or at least, I'm trying to change. Today, when I saw James in danger, I didn't think about anything except saving him. For the first time in my life, someone else's well-being mattered more than my own." Isabella studied his face in the moonlight, searching for truth in features that had learned to hide behind corporate masks. "Prove it," she said simply. "Show me that you can put their needs before your own ambitions. Show me that you can love them without trying to control them. Show me that you understand being a father isn't about providing for them. It's about being present for them." As she walked away, leaving Alexander alone by the lake with the weight of her challenge, he realized that everything he had thought he knew about winning was about to be tested. This wasn't a negotiation he could dominate, or a competition he could outspend his rivals to win. This was about becoming the kind of man who deserved to be called daddy by three incredible boys who had never needed him, but might someday choose to want him. The weeks following Alexander's lakeside confrontation with Isabella became a masterclass in dismantling everything he thought he knew about himself. Isabella had set conditions that felt impossible, yet absolutely necessary. He could begin building a relationship with his sons, but only after proving he had genuinely changed from the man who had valued corporate conquests over human connection. Her first test arrived in a phone call that shattered his morning routine like a sledgehammer through glass. "Alexander, it's Isabella. James is in the hospital." The words hit him with the force of a physical blow, sending his coffee mug crashing to his penthouse floor. "What happened? Is he okay?" "He has pneumonia. It started as a cold, but it got worse overnight. The doctors say he'll be fine with treatment, but—" Isabella's voice cracked with the exhaustion of a single mother facing her worst fears alone. "The medical bills are going to be substantial, and my insurance doesn't cover everything." Alexander's first instinct was pure corporate efficiency. Write a check, solve the problem with money, demonstrate his worth through financial power. But something in Isabella's tone stopped him cold. This wasn't a request for his wealth. This was something far more terrifying and meaningful. "What do you need from me?" he asked, his voice barely steady. "I need you to come to the hospital, not as a benefactor or a solution to our financial problems. I need you to come as someone who cares about James as a person, not as an obligation or an investment in your own redemption." The distinction hit Alexander like lightning, illuminating a landscape he had never seen before. Isabella was offering him the chance to be present during a crisis, to show up not as Alexander Sterling the millionaire, but as someone who loved James simply because he existed. Children's Hospital felt like stepping into a different universe where money couldn't purchase the only currency that mattered: hope mixed with helpless love. Alexander found Isabella in the pediatric ward waiting room, her usually composed demeanor fractured by the particular terror that only parents know. She looked small and vulnerable in a way that made his chest ache with protective instincts he hadn't known he possessed. "How is he?" Alexander asked, settling into the uncomfortable plastic chair beside her. Scared, asking for his brothers, wondering why he can't go home. Isabella's voice carried the weight of someone who had been strong for everyone else and had no strength left for herself. "Daniel and Marcus are staying with my neighbor, but they're worried sick. Marcus keeps asking if James is going to be okay, and I don't know what to tell him." Alexander felt something crack open inside his chest. Not the calculated sympathy he had learned to display in business settings, but raw, unfiltered fear for a child he barely knew but loved, with an intensity that defied logic. "Can I see him?" Isabella nodded, leading him through corridors that smelled like antiseptic and echoed with the soft sounds of medical equipment. James looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, his face flushed with fever, oxygen tubes making him appear fragile as spun glass. When he saw Alexander approach, his eyes lit up with recognition. "Hero man, you came to see me." The pure joy in James's voice nearly destroyed Alexander's composure. His 4-year-old son was sick and scared, but still capable of happiness at seeing someone who had shown him kindness. Alexander sat carefully on the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by the trust radiating from those familiar gray eyes. "How are you feeling, buddy?" "My chest hurts and I can't breathe good. But Mommy says the medicine will make me better." James reached out with a small hand and touched Alexander's sleeve. "Will you read to me? Mommy's voice is tired." Isabella handed Alexander a worn picture book, and for the next hour, he read stories about brave knights and magical kingdoms while James drifted in and out of fevered sleep. Every time the boy stirred, he would look for Alexander's face, as if confirming that his protector hadn't abandoned him. During one of James's deeper sleeps, Isabella pulled Alexander into the hallway. "The doctors want to keep him for several more days. The bills are going to be overwhelming, but that's not why I called you." "Why did you call me?" "Because I wanted to see what you would do, whether you would try to solve this with your checkbook, or whether you would show up as a human being who cares about a sick child." Isabella's eyes searched his face with surgical precision. "You passed the first test." Alexander felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. "First test?" "James asked if you could stay tonight. He's scared of being alone in the dark, and he feels safe when you're here." Isabella's voice carried a challenge wrapped in vulnerability. "But if you stay, Daniel and Marcus are going to want to know why a stranger is spending the night at their little brother's bedside." The implication hit Alexander like a tsunami of possibility and panic. Isabella was offering him the chance to meet his other sons, but in circumstances that would require him to be genuine, present, and focused entirely on their needs, rather than his own agenda. "What would you tell them about who I am?" "The truth. That you're someone who cares about James, someone who wants to help our family, someone who might become important in their lives if they decide they want that." Isabella's words carried the weight of a covenant. "But Alexander, if you meet them, there's no going back. They'll start forming opinions about you based on how you treat them, not how much money you have or how successful your business is." Alexander thought about his penthouse apartment, his scheduled board meetings, his empire that had seemed so important just hours earlier. All of it felt like elaborate set pieces from a play he no longer wanted to perform in. "I want to stay. I want to meet them." Isabella nodded, but her expression remained serious. "Then you need to understand something. Daniel is protective of this family. He's going to test you in ways that boardrooms never could. Marcus is going to want to know if you're here to stay, or if you're just visiting until something more important comes along. And James is going to love you unconditionally, which means you have the power to hurt him in ways that money can't heal." As Isabella left to collect Daniel and Marcus from the neighbor's house, Alexander sat beside James's hospital bed and faced the most terrifying realization of his life. In business, failure meant lost profits and damaged reputation. Here, failure meant breaking the hearts of 3 children who had already learned to live without a father. When the hospital room door opened and 2 young boys entered hesitantly behind their mother, Alexander felt the weight of every choice he had ever made pressing down on him like gravity itself. Daniel, 8 years old with Alexander's intelligent eyes, studied him with the intensity of someone deciding whether to trust. Marcus, 6 and vibrant despite his worry, clutched a hand-drawn picture of his family that included a space where a fourth figure might someday stand. "Boys," Isabella said gently, "this is Alexander. He's the one who helped James when he got scared by the truck. He's going to stay with us tonight to make sure James feels safe." Daniel stepped forward with the gravity of someone much older than his years. "Are you going to be our friend? Or are you just here because you feel sorry for us?" The question hung in the air like a sword balanced on its edge. Alexander looked into the eyes of his eldest son, this remarkable boy who had learned to be a protector and leader before he was old enough for either responsibility, and realized that his answer would determine everything that came next. "I'm here because I care about all of you," Alexander said, his voice steady with truth he had never spoken before. "And I hope, if you'll let me, that I can prove I deserve to be part of your family." Daniel studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay, but if you hurt my mom or my brothers, I'll never forgive you." Alexander felt tears burn behind his eyes at the fierce loyalty in his son's voice. "I understand, and I promise I'll try to earn that trust." As the night wore on and his 3 sons gradually accepted his presence, Alexander realized he was being given the greatest gift of his life, not the chance to be their father, but the opportunity to become worthy of that title. 6 months later, Alexander Sterling stood in the backyard of a modest suburban home that had become more valuable to him than any corporate headquarters he had ever owned. The morning sun filtered through maple trees as he watched Daniel teach Marcus how to throw a curveball while James chased butterflies with the boundless energy of a child who had fully recovered from his hospital stay. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. There had been awkward dinners where Alexander fumbled with bedtime stories, frustrating moments when his corporate instincts clashed with parental patience, and heart-wrenching conversations where Isabella had to remind him that being present meant more than providing expensive gifts. But gradually, something miraculous had occurred. The man who had measured success in quarterly profits began finding joy in finger-painted artwork displayed on refrigerator doors. The executive who had commanded boardrooms with ruthless efficiency discovered that his greatest victory was earning a sleepy, "I love you, Daddy," from James during their nightly reading sessions. Daniel had been the hardest to win over, testing Alexander's commitment with the intensity of someone who had learned too early to protect his family. But the breakthrough came when Alexander showed up to every single one of Daniel's school presentations, choosing his son's poetry, reading over a multi-million-dollar merger meeting. The 8-year-old's proud smile when he spotted his father in the audience had been worth more than any corporate acquisition. Marcus had embraced Alexander with the open heart of a child who believed in second chances but demanded proof through actions rather than words. When Alexander helped him expand his dog-walking business into a neighborhood pet-sitting service, teaching him about customer service and responsibility without overwhelming his childish enthusiasm, Marcus declared him the best business partner ever. Isabella had been the most cautious, watching Alexander navigate fatherhood with the protective instincts of someone who had built a life from the ruins of broken promises. But when she saw him rush home from work to attend James's preschool graduation, his expensive suit wrinkled from sitting cross-legged on tiny plastic chairs, she knew something fundamental had shifted in the man she had once loved. The morning's peaceful family scene was interrupted by Margaret's arrival, carrying documents that represented everything Alexander used to prioritize. She paused at the garden gate, watching her transformed employer push James on a swing while explaining cloud formations with patient enthusiasm. "Sir, the Wellington Industries acquisition papers require your signature," Margaret said, her tone softer than her usual business efficiency. Alexander glanced at the documents that would add another company to his empire, then looked at James, who was begging for just 5 more minutes on the swing. The choice that would have been automatic months ago now required no deliberation at all. "Handle it remotely, Margaret. I'm exactly where I need to be." Margaret smiled, understanding that she was witnessing the completion of a transformation that had taken months to unfold. "Of course, sir. Oh, and the boys' college funds are now fully established, as you requested." As Margaret left, Isabella appeared beside Alexander, slipping her hand into his with the comfortable intimacy of partners who had learned to trust each other again. They stood together, watching their sons play in the garden they had created together, surrounded by the ordinary miracles that Alexander had spent years too busy to notice. "Do you ever miss it?" Isabella asked quietly. "The boardrooms, the power, the constant conquest?" Alexander considered the question seriously, looking at Daniel helping Marcus perfect his pitching form while James collected flowers for his mother. "I thought I was building an empire," he said finally. "But I was just constructing an elaborate prison. This is what empire actually looks like. 3 boys who run to hug you when you come home, a woman who trusts you with her heart again, and the knowledge that you matter to people who love you for who you are, not what you own." That evening, as Alexander tucked James into bed, his youngest son looked up at him with those familiar gray eyes and asked, "Daddy, will you always be here?" The question that would have terrified him months ago now filled Alexander with peaceful certainty. "Always, buddy. I'm never leaving again." As James drifted off to sleep, Alexander realized that his greatest acquisition hadn't been a company or a contract. It had been the chance to become the father his sons deserved, the partner Isabella needed, and the man he had always been meant to be. The millionaire who had once measured success in dollars had finally learned to count what truly mattered. Bedtime kisses, family dinners, and 3 boys who called him Daddy, not because they had to, but because he had earned the privilege of being their hero.